Amelia Langford had buried her husband 3 years earlier. The silver necklace he always wore laid against his heart in the casket. But at a charity auction in New York, the Billionaire CEO went numb when she saw that necklace hanging from the neck of Mason Carter, a poor single father being dragged toward the exit by guards. Mason insisted he had not stolen anything. He said a dying stranger had pressed it into his hand on the last rainy night of his life. Amelia reached for her phone to call the police until a name appeared inside the locket. Stay with this story until the end, because the secret hidden inside that locket will shatter the Langford family legacy. The ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel glittered under 3 crystal chandeliers, and every table had been dressed in white linen for the Langford Foundation charity auction. Amelia Langford stood near the stage in a dark emerald gown, her expression composed in the way that had made her famous across boardrooms from Manhattan to Zurich. She was 34 years old, and to the outside world she looked like a woman who had everything: a company worth billions, a name that opened any door, a face that photographed like a queen on the cover of a business magazine. What the cameras never showed was the quiet ritual she performed every night before sleep, running her thumb over the empty groove at the base of her throat where a necklace used to rest. Jackson had been gone 3 years. He had worn that necklace every day of their marriage, a plain silver chain with a small oval locket, the kind of thing that looked almost too modest for a man who ran one of the largest automotive empires on the East Coast. Amelia had asked him once why he never upgraded to something finer. He had only smiled and said some things were not meant to be improved, only kept. When he died in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside the city, she had made sure the necklace stayed with him, resting against his heart in the casket, the last piece of him she could not bear to keep for herself. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A fundraiser, a few hours of smiling for donors, an early exit before the questions about her personal life started again. Backstage, one of the antique pieces scheduled for auction, a Victorian pocket watch donated by a longtime patron, had jammed its clasp an hour before the event. The event coordinator had scrambled to find a restorer on short notice, and within 40 minutes a quiet, broad-shouldered man had arrived carrying a small leather tool case, introduced only as Mason Carter, a specialist who worked out of a modest shop 2 boroughs away. Mason knelt near a side table beneath the stage lights, hunched over the watch with the kind of stillness that came from years of careful, unglamorous work. He did not look up at the guests filing past, did not seem to notice the diamonds and tailored suits drifting around him. His hands moved with a patience that seemed out of place in a room built entirely around spectacle. He wore a plain collared shirt, slightly frayed at the cuffs, the clothing of a man who had learned to make things last rather than replace them. As he leaned forward to adjust his grip on the tiny screwdriver, the top button of his collar shifted, and a thin silver chain slipped free, swinging gently in the light. Amelia, crossing the room to greet a donor, caught the glint of metal from the corner of her eye and stopped walking entirely. For a moment the noise of the ballroom seemed to fall away. She knew that chain. She knew the small oval locket hanging from it, the faint scratch near its clasp that she had memorized without ever meaning to. It was impossible, and yet it was there, resting against a stranger's collarbone as though it belonged to him. Her first instinct was disbelief, the kind that insists the eyes are playing tricks under bad lighting. She moved closer, weaving between guests who reached out to greet her, ignoring every one of them. By the time she reached the small table where Mason knelt, her heart was pounding in a way it had not in years. She stood over him, staring down at the necklace, and for several seconds she could not make herself speak, because the last time she had seen that locket, it had been resting on her husband's chest inside a closed coffin. A security guard reached them before Amelia found her voice. He had noticed her expression and misread it as the reaction of a woman who had spotted a thief among her guests. Without waiting for instruction, he seized Mason by the arm and hauled him upright, nearly knocking the tool case from the table. Mason did not resist, but his jaw tightened, and he said quietly that he had not stolen anything, that the necklace was his own and had been for 3 years. The guard did not listen. He began pulling Mason toward a side exit, past tables of donors who had turned to watch the small commotion with the polite curiosity of people who enjoyed drama that was not their own. Amelia finally spoke, her voice sharper than she intended. She told the guard to stop and let go of the man's arm. The order carried the weight of a woman who owned the building they were standing in, and the guard obeyed instantly, releasing Mason and stepping back with an apologetic nod. Amelia ignored him entirely. Her eyes were fixed on the necklace, on the small locket swinging faintly against Mason's chest, and she asked him, in a voice that shook more than she liked, where he had gotten it. Mason straightened his collar and met her gaze without flinching. He said a man had given it to him 3 years earlier, on a night he would never forget, a night of heavy rain on an empty stretch of highway outside the city. Amelia felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. 3 years. The timing matched the night Jackson died so precisely that for a moment she wondered if she had misheard him over the noise of the room. She asked him to repeat himself, and he did, calmly, as though he understood exactly how strange his words sounded and had long ago accepted that no one would believe him easily. He said the man had been trapped in a wrecked car, bleeding badly, and that there had been no time to wait for an ambulance to arrive before the man stopped breathing. Before he died, he had pressed the necklace into Mason's palm and told him to give it to someone who deserved to know the truth. Mason had never learned who that someone was supposed to be because the locket would not open, no matter what tool he tried against its clasp. Amelia felt something cold settle in her chest, a mixture of grief and fury that she had not experienced since the funeral itself. She wanted to believe this was a lie, an elaborate story invented by a desperate man caught wearing a dead man's jewelry. It would have been easier that way, cleaner, a simple case for the police to resolve before dessert was served. But something about the way Mason spoke, without pleading, without trying to soften the story to make himself sound sympathetic, made the easy explanation harder to hold on to. Evelyn Langford appeared at Amelia's shoulder before she could ask another question, her silver hair immaculate, her voice carrying the practiced calm of a woman who had spent decades managing crises before they became public. She said this man was clearly exploiting the family's tragedy for attention or money, and that security should call the police immediately rather than entertain a stranger's fantasy in front of half the donors in New York. Mason did not argue with her. He only turned back to Amelia and asked quietly if she would look at the necklace herself before deciding anything. Amelia reached out, and Mason unclasped the chain and placed it gently in her palm. She turned the small oval locket over with trembling fingers, searching the back of it out of instinct rather than any real expectation, and there it was. A thin scratch near the hinge that she and Jackson had joked about years earlier, the one flaw in an otherwise perfect gift, the one detail only the two of them had ever discussed. Her breath caught. She looked up at Evelyn and said, in a voice that left no room for argument, that no one was calling the police until she understood exactly what had happened. Amelia led Mason through a service corridor behind the ballroom, away from the noise and the curious stares, into a small private office usually reserved for the hotel's events staff. She asked her assistant to summon Connor Blake, the family's longtime attorney, and to make sure no one else was informed of what was happening until she said otherwise. Connor arrived within 10 minutes, still in his evening jacket, his expression tightening the moment he saw the necklace resting on the desk between them. He had known Jackson for over 15 years, long enough to recognize the piece on sight. Mason sat across from Amelia, his tool case open beside him, and asked if he could try something. He explained that a locket that refused to open for years usually meant a corroded hinge or a hidden catch rather than a true lock, the kind of small mechanical failure he dealt with every week in his shop. Amelia hesitated, then nodded, watching as he selected a narrow pick from his case and worked with the same unhurried patience he had shown at the auction table, ignoring the tension in the room entirely. After a few minutes of careful pressure, the locket gave way with a soft click. Amelia leaned forward, half expecting to see the photograph she and Jackson had placed inside years earlier, the one taken on their wedding day. Instead, there was no photograph at all. Folded into a square smaller than a postage stamp was a scrap of paper, brittle with age, tucked so tightly into the frame that Mason had to use tweezers to draw it free without tearing it. Connor unfolded the paper with careful hands and read the message aloud in a voice that had gone unsteady. It said simply, "If I am gone, find Carter." Amelia felt the words land like a physical blow. She looked at Mason, whose full name she now realized she had never actually asked. He told her quietly that his name was Mason Carter, and that he had never met a man named Jackson Langford in his life, not once, not even in passing, before the night on the highway. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Connor stared at the handwriting on the paper for a long moment before saying, with a strange heaviness in his voice, that he recognized it. It was Jackson's handwriting, the same careful, slightly slanted script he had seen on countless contracts and personal letters over the years. Amelia took the paper from him and studied it herself, and something in her chest twisted painfully, because she recognized it too. The office door opened without a knock, and Evelyn stepped inside, her composure slightly frayed at the edges. She demanded to know what the note said, and when no one answered quickly enough, She reached for the necklace on the desk, as though she intended to take it away entirely. Amelia stopped her hand before she could touch it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she looked directly at her mother-in-law with open suspicion rather than the deference she had always shown her. Beneath the folded note, half hidden in the lining of the locket, Mason found something else, a short sequence of numbers etched so faintly into the metal that it was barely visible without close inspection. Connor leaned in to examine it and went pale. He said quietly that the format matched the kind of code used for a private safe, and that he remembered years earlier hearing rumors of a safe belonging to Jackson that had never been listed among the family's official assets. Amelia looked at the numbers, then at Mason, then at Evelyn's unreadable expression, and made a decision. She stood, gathered the necklace and the note, and announced that the rest of the auction would proceed without her, because she had somewhere else she needed to be. Langford Tower stood nearly empty at that hour, its lobby lit only by the soft glow of security lamps. The elevators hushed as Amelia, Mason, and Connor rode up to the executive floor Jackson had once occupied. Evelyn had followed them from the hotel, insisting the entire time that digging through a dead man's private office would accomplish nothing but reopening wounds that had finally begun to close. She stood in the hallway outside Jackson's old office, arguing that some things were better left buried with the people who carried them. Amelia turned to face her mother-in-law directly, something she rarely did. She said, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she had spent 3 years living with a version of her husband's death that had never fully made sense to her, and that she would rather face an uncomfortable truth than continue pretending a comfortable lie was peace. Evelyn's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into practiced calm. She did not follow them inside. The office had been left largely untouched since Jackson's death, preserved more out of sentiment than necessity, his desk still holding a few personal items no one had ever found the heart to remove. Mason ran his fingers along the built-in bookshelf on the far wall, and Connor, who had spent countless hours in that room over the years, mentioned that Jackson once joked about a hiding place clever enough that even his own mother could not find it. Following the numbers from the locket, Mason located a small seam behind a row of leather-bound books, and behind it a compact safe built directly into the wall. His hands trembled slightly as he entered the sequence, but the mechanism responded, and the door swung open to reveal a modest stack of documents, a handful of photographs, and a small digital recorder. Amelia knelt beside him, pulling out a folder first, and found hospital records, lab results, and correspondence that had nothing to do with the company's public history. Near the bottom of the stack was a letter unfinished, in Jackson's handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, as though he had been working through his thoughts, rather than preparing to send it. The letter described a discovery Jackson had made regarding a record swap that had taken place years earlier, following an accident the company had quietly buried rather than properly investigated. Amelia read the words slowly, her stomach tightening with every sentence, as her husband detailed his growing certainty that the Langford family had allowed an innocent employee to take the blame for something that was never his fault. The name Carter appeared twice in the letter, described as the man wrongly blamed for the failure. Mason went very still when he heard the name read aloud. He said quietly that Carter had been his father's name too, and that his father had worked as a safety engineer for the family's automotive division decades earlier, before losing everything in circumstances Mason had never fully understood as a child. Amelia looked at him, then at the documents spread across the floor, and felt the shape of something much larger than a missing necklace beginning to take form. She sat back against the edge of the desk, the letter still in her hands, and admitted quietly that she was beginning to understand this was never only about her husband's death. It was about something the Langford family had done long before she ever married into it, something Jackson had discovered and never lived long enough to make right. Connor gathered the documents carefully into a single folder, saying they would need to move slowly and carefully from here, because whatever they were uncovering clearly involved more than one person willing to keep it buried. Mason sat on the floor of Jackson's old office with his back against the bookshelf, holding one of the photographs from the safe, an old company badge with his father's face on it, younger than Mason had ever known him. He began to speak, slowly at first, as though the memory had to be pried loose from somewhere he had not visited in a long time. His father, David Carter, had worked as a safety engineer at Langford Motors during a period when the company was racing to bring a new line of vehicles to market ahead of schedule. David had discovered a serious flaw in the braking system of a test model, something that could fail under specific conditions, and he had documented it thoroughly before submitting his findings to his supervisors. Mason said his father had been proud of that report, certain that raising the issue early would prevent a disaster later. Instead, the report was altered before it reached the executives who mattered, and the flaw remained uncorrected. When an accident eventually occurred involving one of the vehicles, the company needed someone to blame quickly, and the altered records made David Carter appear negligent rather than diligent. Mason described growing up watching his father fight a battle he could never win, spending his savings on lawyers who could not overturn a paper trail that had already been rewritten against him. David Carter lost his job, then his reputation, then slowly over years, whatever pride he had left. He died when Mason was still young, worn down by shame that was never his to carry. Mason had grown up hearing his family's name spoken with pity or contempt, and had learned early to keep his head down and ask for nothing from anyone. Amelia listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of every word settle over her like something physical. She thought of Jackson, who had taken over leadership of the company not long after that very accident, stepping into a role built partly on a foundation she now understood had been poisoned from the start. She wondered how much of it he had known when he accepted the position, and how much he had only discovered later after it was too late to undo the damage quietly. Connor, flipping through another section of the documents, found a series of dated notes in Jackson's handwriting that appeared to trace an informal investigation, one Jackson had clearly been conducting on his own, without informing the board or even his closest advisors. The dates suggested this investigation had been active in the weeks leading up to his death, far more recent than Amelia had ever imagined. She had always believed Jackson died in a simple, tragic accident, one of thousands that happened on wet highways every year. Nothing in the official report had ever suggested otherwise. Connor said quietly that if Jackson had been actively digging into a decades-old cover-up in the days before his death, that timing alone was worth examining more closely, regardless of how uncomfortable the implications might be. Evelyn's earlier panic, her insistence on calling the police the moment the necklace appeared, her refusal to let them enter this office suddenly seemed less like grief and more like fear of exactly what they were now finding. Amelia looked at Mason, who was still staring at his father's photograph, and said softly that whatever role fate had played in placing him at that accident scene 3 years ago, it no longer felt like a coincidence to her. Jackson had been searching for a way to make things right with the Carter family before he died, and somehow, without either of them planning it, his path had crossed with theirs on the one night it mattered most. At the bottom of the safe, wrapped in a soft cloth, Connor found a small digital recorder, the kind meant for dictating quick notes rather than long recordings. Its battery was nearly dead, but Connor had a charging cable in his car and returned minutes later to plug it in, his hands unsteady in a way Amelia had never seen from him before. When the device finally powered on, a single file appeared on its screen, dated 1 week before Jackson's death, with no title beyond a string of numbers. Amelia asked Connor to play it. The recording began with a burst of static, then Jackson's voice filled the small office, quieter and more tired than she remembered him, but unmistakably his. He said he was recording this in case something happened to him before he could finish what he had started, and that he needed the truth written down somewhere. It could not be quietly erased the way so much else had been. Amelia's hands tightened around the edge of the desk. Jackson explained that he had found proof his father's company, and later his own, had destroyed evidence to protect itself after the accident decades earlier, and that an innocent engineer named David Carter had been sacrificed to preserve the family's reputation. He said he had located witnesses who were paid to alter their statements, and that at least one member of his own family had personally overseen the effort to keep the truth buried. He did not name the person directly on the recording, as though he feared even a private device might not stay private forever. The most difficult part of the recording came near its end. Jackson's voice grew lower, almost hesitant, as he said he believed someone close to him had grown aware of his investigation, and that he no longer felt entirely safe continuing it in the open. He said if anything happened to him that seemed accidental, Amelia should not assume it actually was. Amelia felt her throat close entirely, the office around her blurring at the edges as she listened to her husband, 3 years gone, warning her from beyond his own death. He spoke directly to her near the very end, his voice softening in a way that made the recording almost unbearable to hear. He said he was sorry he had not told her the truth sooner, that he had wanted to protect her from it until he had enough proof to fix things properly, and that if she was ever hearing this recording, It likely meant he had run out of time to do it himself. Amelia pressed a hand over her mouth, unable to stop the tears that came quickly and without warning. Mason sat very still throughout the recording, hearing for the first time in his life someone with power and standing say plainly that his father had been innocent, that the shame his family carried for decades had never belonged to them at all. He did not speak. He simply stared at the small recorder as though it might vanish if he looked away, absorbing a vindication that had come 3 years too late for his father to hear it himself. The recording ended with one final line, delivered so quietly that Connor had to replay it twice to be certain of the words. Jackson said, "Amelia, do not trust whoever cries loudest at my funeral." The room went silent. Amelia's mind moved instantly, involuntarily, to the memory of Evelyn collapsing into sobs at the graveside, the woman who had orchestrated every detail of the service, who had never once let Amelia grieve without supervision. What had felt like devastating loss for years suddenly reshaped itself into something far more calculated and far more frightening. By morning, Evelyn had already heard fragments of what happened at Langford Tower, and she arrived at Amelia's penthouse unannounced, her composure sharpened into something closer to armor. She denied every implication before Amelia had even finished describing the recording, insisting that Jackson had been consumed by guilt in his final months, imagining conspiracies that existed only in his own troubled mind. She said grief could do strange things to a person's judgment, and that Amelia, of all people, should understand that better than anyone. When Amelia mentioned Mason directly, Evelyn's tone shifted toward something colder. She suggested he was nothing more than an opportunist who had recognized a chance to manipulate a grieving widow, using a sad story about his father to worm his way into the family's fortune. Amelia felt anger rise in her chest at the accusation, sharper than she expected, because nothing about Mason's demeanor since the auction had suggested a man chasing money. He had, if anything, seemed reluctant to be involved at all. Within days, fragments of the story reached the press, likely leaked from someone inside the hotel or the tower itself. Headlines speculated about a scandal at Langford Industries, about a mysterious necklace and a stranger dragged out of a charity gala, about whispers of a decades-old cover-up finally resurfacing. The company's stock dipped sharply within hours of the first article, and the board of directors demanded an emergency call with Amelia before the situation spiraled further out of their control. Several board members urged her plainly to distance herself from Mason entirely, to issue a statement dismissing the necklace as a strange coincidence, and to let quiet legal pathways handle any lingering questions about the old accident. They reminded her more than once that her responsibility was to the company's stability and to thousands of employees whose jobs depended on public confidence in Langford Industries. Amelia understood the pressure, but for the first time in her professional life, the safe corporate choice felt unbearable to her. Mason, sensing the storm gathering around her because of him, offered to walk away entirely. He told Amelia, standing in her office doorway with his tool case still in hand, that he had never wanted to be the center of a scandal, that he had only ever wanted answers about his father, and that he would rather disappear quietly than watch her company collapse because of what he had accidentally uncovered. Amelia stopped him before he reached the elevator, telling him plainly that Jackson had chosen him for a reason, because he was the one person who had never tried to sell the truth for his own gain. Connor warned them both that emotion alone would not be enough to survive what was coming. A recording and a handwritten note, however compelling, could be challenged in court as unreliable or even fabricated without stronger physical evidence to support them. Mason, turning the problem over in his mind, suddenly remembered something the dying man on the highway had said in his final moments. Something about a warehouse to the north that Mason had dismissed at the time as the confused words of a man losing consciousness. Amelia decided almost immediately that they needed to find that warehouse, regardless of the risk. She understood Evelyn was likely watching her every move now, aware that the investigation had not stopped simply because she wanted it to. But she also understood that stopping now would mean burying her husband's final wish for the second time, and she was no longer willing to do that, no matter what it cost the company or her own carefully built reputation. The warehouse sat at the edge of an industrial stretch north of the city, a squat brick building surrounded by chain-link fencing and weeds that had grown unchecked for years. Company records listed the property as decommissioned after a fire decades earlier, one of countless old assets that Langford Industries had simply stopped mentioning once it no longer served any purpose. Amelia, Mason, and Connor arrived just after dusk, using an old set of keys Connor had found among Jackson's personal effects, keys that still, somehow, opened the rusted padlock on the side entrance. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold metal, and rows of empty shelving stretched into the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Mason moved along one wall slowly, running his fingers over faint markings stamped into the metal supports, a habit born from years of restoring old mechanisms that often carried small, deliberate signatures from the people who built them. He recognized the pattern immediately as one his father used to sketch absent-mindedly on scrap paper at home. A private mark David Carter had apparently used in his engineering work decades earlier. Following that pattern to the far corner of the building, they found a section of wall that sounded hollow when Mason knocked against it, a poorly disguised, false panel built to like the rest of the structure. Behind it, protected from decades of dust, sat a row of sealed storage containers. Inside the first one, Connor found stacks of original engineering reports untouched since the day they were hidden, their pages confirming everything Jackson's letter had only hinted at. The reports showed unmistakably that the breaking flaw had been identified and documented correctly by David Carter, and that the failure to act on his warnings belonged entirely to the executives above him, men who had chosen speed to market over safety. A second container held something even more damning. A ledger of payments made to several former employees around the time of the accident, each one listed beside a brief note describing altered testimony. Near the bottom of several entries, in a tight, familiar handwriting, was the name Evelyn Langford. Connor found one final document in the third container, a memo dated just 8 days before Jackson's death, requesting the formal reopening of the original accident investigation, signed by Jackson himself. It was the clearest proof yet that his private inquiry had reached a point of real consequence, one that someone with everything to lose might have felt desperate enough to stop by any means necessary. Amelia stared at her husband's signature, feeling the full weight of what he had been carrying alone in his final days. The warehouse's old security cameras, which none of them had realized were still active, flickered and cut to static without warning. Moments later, the sound of a vehicle pulling up outside reached them through the thin walls, followed by voices demanding, none too politely, that they hand over whatever they had taken from the property. Mason recognized an old maintenance corridor near the loading dock, one clearly built into the original blueprints his father might once have reviewed, and guided Amelia toward it while Connor worked frantically to scan and upload copies of the most critical documents to a secure legal server before anyone could intervene. They slipped out through the side corridor just as the warehouse's main door was forced open behind them, the sound of raised voices fading as they reached the car and pulled away into the dark. Amelia sat in the back seat, clutching a folder of photographed evidence, her hands still trembling, no longer from grief alone but from a clear and settling anger. Evelyn was not simply protecting an old secret out of shame. She was still, even now, willing to silence anyone who threatened to expose it, and Amelia understood there was no turning back from what they had just found. 2 days later, Amelia called an emergency session of the Langford board, requesting that every member attend in person rather than remotely, a demand that immediately signaled something serious was coming. Evelyn arrived early, seated at the head of the long conference table with the calm certainty of a woman who did not believe Amelia would ever risk the family name in public, regardless of what she claimed to have found. Mason waited outside the boardroom, uncertain whether he even belonged in a room like that, a quiet man in a borrowed jacket surrounded by decades of corporate history that had nearly destroyed his family. Amelia began without preamble, placing the necklace on the table where every board member could see it, followed by a printed transcript of Jackson's recording, copies of the warehouse documents, and the ledger listing altered testimony payments. She spoke evenly, without the emotional edge she might have used a week earlier, letting the evidence itself carry the weight of the accusation rather than her own outrage. Connor confirmed for the room that all original documents had already been submitted to outside legal counsel and, as of that morning, to relevant regulatory authorities as well. Evelyn's composure cracked for the first time in front of the board. She insisted that Jackson had been unwell in his final months, prone to imagined betrayals, and that whatever guilt he felt over his family's past had clearly distorted his judgment beyond reason. She called the entire investigation a fabrication built around a con artist who had seen an opportunity in a widow's grief. Amelia felt something inside her finally give way completely, and for the first time in years she did not soften her words to keep the peace. She told Evelyn plainly that Jackson had not betrayed the family. He had tried, in the only way he knew how, to save what little honor it had left. Mason was invited into the room at that point, and he spoke briefly without asking for money or sympathy, saying only that he wanted his father's name entered into the official record as what it always should have been, an honest engineer who told the truth when it was inconvenient and paid for it with everything he had. A quiet stir moved through the room when one of the older board members, a man who had served on the Langford board since before the original accident, rose slowly to his feet. He said he had carried guilt for over 20 years, having been pressured at the time to sign statements he knew were misleading, and that he could no longer sit silently while the truth was called a fabrication in front of him. His confirmation, delivered before witnesses and later before investigators, became the turning point the case needed. The board voted within the hour to strip Evelyn of her remaining advisory role and all associated privileges within the company, a decision made easier by the mounting evidence and the very public unraveling of her denials. Security escorted her from the building not long after, though she left with her head held high, still insisting she had done nothing but protect a family that had never deserved to be protected from itself. Law enforcement, already alerted by Connor's earlier filings, arrived at the tower within the hour to begin formally reviewing the evidence tied to both the decades-old cover-up and the more recent questions surrounding Jackson's death. Amelia watched from the boardroom window as Evelyn was led toward a waiting car, feeling not triumph but something closer to exhaustion, the particular emptiness that follows the collapse of an illusion someone has lived inside for far too long. In the weeks that followed, investigators pieced together a fuller picture of Jackson's final days, drawing on the recovered documents, the recording, and testimony from the board member who had finally come forward. It became clear that Jackson had planned to meet Mason directly, intending to hand over the evidence in person and explain everything face to face, but circumstances on that rainy night had overtaken his plan before he ever reached him. Jackson had not known, until his investigation was nearly complete, that the man he intended to meet carried the very name his family had wronged decades earlier. Once he made that connection, Jackson had wanted to deliver the truth himself, in person, with the kind of humility he felt his family owed the Carter name after all those years of silence. He had hoped to formally clear David Carter's reputation while the man's son was still young enough to build a different kind of life, free of the shame that had followed their family for so long. Evelyn, investigators later confirmed, had grown aware of Jackson's inquiry in its final weeks, alerted by one of the very employees he had been quietly interviewing. The official accident report, re-examined under new scrutiny, revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored 3 years earlier, details suggesting the vehicle's steering system had been tampered with before Jackson ever left that evening. It was no longer treated as a simple tragedy but as a possible act of deliberate harm, one that investigators now believed had been arranged to silence him before he could expose what he had found. The rainy highway where his car went off the road was the very same stretch where Mason happened to be driving home that night. Mason, questioned extensively during the investigation, described finding Jackson's car overturned in a ditch, the only person to stop on an empty road in the middle of a storm. He had crawled through broken glass to reach him, had held his hand as he struggled to breathe, and had listened as Jackson pressed the necklace into his palm and asked him, with what little strength remained, to make sure it reached someone who deserved to know the truth inside it. Mason had never known, in that moment, that the man dying in his arms had spent his final weeks trying to clear his father's name. For 3 years, Mason carried that necklace as a private burden, unable to open it, unsure who the intended recipient was supposed to be, wearing it close to his chest the way one carries an unfinished promise. Amelia listened to this account with a grief that had softened into something gentler than before, no longer the sharp, disorienting pain of new loss but something closer to understanding. She realized Mason had not stolen a piece of her husband's memory at all. He had guarded Jackson's final wish more faithfully than anyone else could have. The revelation, once confirmed publicly, altered the way the entire city understood the Langford name, transforming years of quiet corporate mythology into something far more human and far more complicated. Reporters who had once written speculative headlines about a mysterious necklace now published detailed accounts of a decades-old injustice finally coming to light, of an innocent engineer's name being restored, and of a widow who had chosen truth over the comfortable silence her family had maintained for so long. What had begun as suspicion and heartbreak slowly, publicly, became something closer to redemption for everyone still living to see it. A month after the board hearing, Amelia stood before a room full of reporters for a press conference she had personally insisted on holding, refusing the polished statement her communications team had drafted in favor of speaking plainly, in her own words. She apologized publicly to the Carter family, acknowledging the decades of harm caused by a cover-up her own family had orchestrated and maintained, and she promised that Langford Industries would formally correct the historical record regarding the accident and the engineer wrongly blamed for it. Alongside the apology, she announced the creation of a restitution fund intended to support employees and families harmed by the company's past decisions, a fund overseen not by executives, but by an independent board that included outside advocates with no ties to Langford leadership. It was a costly decision, one that shook investor confidence in the short term, but Amelia told the board plainly that a company built on buried harm was never truly stable to begin with, no matter how strong its quarterly earnings appeared. Mason, when offered a formal role within the new fund or a financial settlement of his own, declined both without hesitation. He said he had never wanted power or money from any of this, only the simple long-overdue correction of history, his father's name recorded honestly rather than erased under suspicion. His one request was modest, that David Carter's original engineering reports be permanently displayed, unaltered, in the company's historical archive, so that no future employee would ever again wonder whether honesty had been worth the cost. Amelia offered to return the necklace to him permanently, telling him quietly that Jackson had chosen him to carry it for a reason she now understood completely. Mason held the small silver chain for a long moment before gently placing it back into her hands. He said the necklace had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to the love between her and Jackson, and to the promise her husband had died trying to keep, and it deserved to stay somewhere it could be honored rather than hidden away in a drawer. Together, they decided the necklace would be placed inside a new memorial room being built at Langford headquarters, displayed beside a framed copy of David Carter's original, vindicated report. It became in time a quiet stop for employees who wanted to remember that a company's greatest asset was never its buildings or its stock price, but the honesty of the people willing to speak up when something was wrong, whatever the cost to themselves. Amelia changed in the months that followed, softening in small, visible ways that longtime colleagues noticed but rarely mentioned aloud. She began taking responsibility publicly for decisions that went wrong instead of quietly redirecting blame, a habit she had learned, without realizing it, from the very cover-up culture she had just spent months dismantling. Mason continued his quiet work restoring old watches and forgotten heirlooms, no longer carrying the particular shame that had followed his family's name for decades, though he remained by nature unassuming about the small piece of history he had helped uncover. A careful friendship grew between them in the months that followed, unhurried and unforced, built on the kind of trust that comes only from surviving something difficult together. Neither rushed toward anything more than that, understanding instinctively that healing needed room to breathe before it could become anything else. On a quiet afternoon, months after the press conference had faded from the headlines, Amelia stood alone in the new memorial room, looking at the necklace resting behind glass beside her husband's final letter, and understood, finally, that the most painful truths a person could uncover were sometimes also the last and most enduring gift the dead could leave behind. Some truths stay buried for years, not because they are forgotten, but because someone with power decides silence is easier than justice. Jackson Langford spent his final days trying to undo a wrong his own family had carried for decades, and it took a stranger's honesty, a locked necklace, and one dying wish to finally bring that truth into the light. Mason Carter never asked for wealth or recognition. He only wanted his father's name spoken with dignity again, and in the end, that quiet request changed an entire company more than any boardroom strategy ever could. If this story moved you, take a moment to sit with it, because somewhere, someone is still waiting for the truth to finally set them free.